Okay, well, welcome in this fifth office hour um, for macroeconomic principles 211. I'm going to talk today a little bit about two questions. Namely, one was on the grading curve that was posted on the discussion board, so I will clear that up. For which our apologies, because we posted something inconsistent, but we will adhere to the most lenient curve, which is determined by the progress bar. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that as we in a next couple of minutes. Then I'll answer a question by Igor about L'Esper's and price indices, and then I'll continue and give you an overview of what's happening in week 5, which is about the government and the role of government in the economy. So before we do anything else during this office hour, let me clear something up because it's of first order importance for your grade. In order to do that, let me go to the discussion board posting that's immediately relevant for this. Let me share my screen with you so you can see this as well. Share. So one of the issues that some of you noted is that the progress bar shows that the grade of C earned with a final grade of 60, B at 75, and A at 88. Then the syllabus says the cutoff points are 70, 80, and 90. And the question is, can you clarify 60 is sufficient for a C or 70 required? 60 is sufficient for a C. We will judge this class by the progress bar. We had updated that, and the syllabus still reflects an old grading standard we had the previous time we ran the course. But we changed the curve on this, and so the curve is more lenient than the syllabus actually reflects. It's in line with the progress bar. My understanding for that, the other question then is, when can you get credit for the course? And credit for the course you can get if you have a C or higher. Hopefully that resolves the questions about the grading. So that's the answer. If you go down, I posted the reply to this, that you can get credit for a C or higher. If you click here, you'll see the discussion board about credit eligibility. So please go there and read up on it if you want to have more information. So that's pretty much everything I can say about the grading. Our apologies that the syllabus was out of sync with the actual settings in edX, but the edX settings are correct. So here I'm back again. I hope that's good news, because that means that all of you are having a higher grade, the grade that you see on the progress bar, rather than what the syllabus reflects. Well, that leaves us to helping you get an even higher grade going forward. So let me do that in the, let me see what I can contribute to that in the next 40 minutes. The first thing I'd like to do is address a question that Igor asked, related to a question on the midterm exam. So Igor asked a question about the L'Esper's and the Prash index. So here's a chart that's taken from the midterm exam. Let me zoom in on it for you. That gives you the ingredients in different types of ice cream. The one that I used last year and the one that I used this year. If you have to calculate the L'Esper's price index, you're calculating the percent increase in the cost of what you bought last year. So you look at the blue stuff, look at what it cost this year, and what it cost last year, what it cost this year. So 71.75 this year, 55.50 last year. So what's the percent increase from 71.75 175 to 55.50. That would be the increase according to the Laspers index. The Page index would do the opposite. It would compare what you buy today and look at what it costs today relative to what it cost in the previous period. Now, that is basically the difference. That the price of what you bought today is higher than yesterday doesn't matter. What matters is that I could have bought this year what I bought last year, but I decided not to buy it. That doesn't mean that depends. It depends on the level of the price, the relative level. But it is my revealed preference now that at the current prices, I would like to buy the ingredients that are highlighted in red and not the one that used to be highlighted in blue. At the current prices, I prefer these. So if I would calculate the Laspers index, I'm still comparing yesterday's prices of the blue goods with the prices of the blue goods in this period, but I'm not buying those. So the fact that the Laspers overestimates inflation because of that, because of the substitution bias, does not affect the way the inflation rate is actually being calculated. So I hope that helps. The level of these prices doesn't. It matters because the consumer at the end reveals which ones they want to buy. But just the fact that they shifted from the blue one to the red one means that today, this year, they prefer to buy the red ones at the ongoing prices over buying the blue ingredients at the prices that are set this year. And that's the most important thing. That doesn't necessarily mean the prices have to be higher or lower. I mean, I could prefer to buy a Mercedes-Benz for $35,000 this year, comparable to, say, a Mini Cooper for $28,000. This Mercedes-Benz still has a higher price, but it's a bit better value for money because the value, because the Mercedes-Benz would give you more enjoyment than the Mini Cooper. So these things all depend on kind of how much enjoyment you get out of what you buy. I hope that helps, and that answers your question, Igor. So it's not about the level of the prices, it's about what you decide to buy at the current prevailing prices. And I know, Igor, you asked a question last week about stimulus, and I'll address that a little today, but it was about when inflation is high and output is low, what can the government do to stimulate the economy? That's best understood with the material you learned next week on monetary policy. So I will revisit that question a little bit today when we talk about what the government can do in terms of fiscal policy. And then next week we'll go put inflation and prices in the mix, and we'll talk about it one more time. I hope that helps and helps you better understand how stagflation can be helped or can be offset by monetary policy, or cannot be offset by monetary policy, can be potentially offset by fiscal policy, or cannot be. So that question was a little bit ahead of its time, but we're catching up to it. So next week we'll do those details. So that is for the two things I wanted to deal with before I wanted to talk about this week's material. This week's material has to do with the government, and so let me start off by saying one thing, which is that the role of the government in the allocation of resources and in any economy in the world is one of the most controversial topics in macroeconomics. And there's very different views from people who support communism, where the government would basically be in control of the whole allocation of resources, to people who are free market economists, who feel that the market is the efficient way of allocating resources in an economy. Now, because this is a macroeconomic theory course and not and really it relies on market economics. It's not some communist economics class, but there are classes where people would talk more about the centrally planned economy. As you can see from this course, we start off with the market efficiency as the benchmark. That doesn't mean that every market is efficient. As you learned in part 4, there are major inefficiencies in some major markets in the economy. But still, we're using the market as a benchmark for the allocation of resources. We discussed last week when we spoke about it, the week before in week 3, when we spoke about the social planner, that it's nice to think about someone planning the whole economy out, but it's hard for this person to fully understand everything that's going on in the economy. It's easier for everyone individually to actually make their own decisions based on their own information. And most centrally planned economies are also subject to the government actually taking a lot of resources away. That's called a kleptocracy. Now, that's not to say that democracies are not subject to some of that, and that there's not some form of crony capitalism in the world, or some forms where politicians are getting paid kickbacks in democracies for their decisions. Clearly, money is important everywhere and has an effect on every political process. But at the end, when you learn about the market mechanism, that's giving you a really useful way to think about the efficient benchmark, which we've taught you in week 3. And then we said, listen, this is your benchmark. Think of this as utopia. Let's look at how the real world deviates from it. And that's what we've done. And we've done that in the second part of week 3.2, part 3.2. We spoke about potential sources of deviations, and then we looked at applications in terms of public goods, in terms of the market for knowledge and ideas, and in terms of the labor market, in terms of the market for medical care. So those are all markets where, the market mechanism is a useful benchmark, but there are reasons for the market mechanism, the actual allocation of resources to deviate from the efficient allocation. So once you think that these deviations are substantial, you can think about roles for the government to intervene to improve the allocation. Now, the first question then is, how substantial are these deviations? And do you think they're actually substantial? And there are some people who believe they're not very much so. There's actually very little reason to intervene in the market. I'm not telling you one way or the other. You have to make up your own mind about what these distortions and rigidities and frictions and externalities can be and are, and how important they are. And if they exist, those are a real cost to relying on the market mechanism, because in those cases the market mechanism will not be efficient. Now, if that's the case, there might be a role for the government to intervene. And this can be in the long run, where the government looks at distortions that cause the long run trend, the upward trend of GDP growth, to either shift the level up such that the trend is going to be higher, or even increase the growth rate so that GDP will go up steeper. So those are long run effects. Or remember, the business cycle always wobbles around the trend of GDP. The other thing the government can do is, if those distortions are bigger during economic downturns and expansions, the government could try and stabilize those downturns and expansions, and that's called stabilization policy. So this week, in week 5, the 2 parts of week 5 are split up as follows. First, we're just going to look at accounting for what the government does. And then we're going to ask ourselves, with the instruments the government has at hand, how can it pursue, how does it do its actions affect long-run economic outcomes, and how do its actions affect the magnitude and frequency of business cycles? So those are the 2 questions in the second part of this week. In many macroeconomic classes, these topics, especially the stabilization policy topics, are taught according to a school of macroeconomics. Now, I don't particularly care about what school you belong to or I belong to. I want you to understand what the costs and the benefits are of each of these arguments that people have, and each of these ways for the government to intervene in the market. And then you think about how big you think those costs and benefits are, and most importantly, how big you think the marginal cost and the marginal benefits are. Because remember, if you want to choose some optimal choice, you're equating the marginal cost to the marginal benefit. So largely, these parts are designed for you to think through what are the costs and the benefits of government intervention in the economy. Maybe you don't think there are any benefits. That might well be true. I personally think that there might be some, but I think also that in many discussions people tend to oversell those benefits and tend to underemphasize the costs, or the other way around. So this part is really about that. But in order to understand the costs and benefits, the first thing you need to do is to really think about how we account for government spending. So that's done in part 5.1. So let me show you kind of a couple of basic slides from part 5.1. Give me a moment. I'm going to pull them up and I'll share the screen with you in a second. Okay, you might have already seen the reflection of what I was looking at in my glasses, but let's look at the actual stuff here. So the most important thing, since we're relying on the circular flow diagram as our simplified representation of the economy. Let's start with that. So in the circular flow diagram, the government is one of the four major sectors in the economy. And there's basically four arrows that either go to or from the government. We will talk about government borrowing later on, but think of government borrowing as kind of the residual thing the government does in its actions. If it's deciding to spend more in terms of transfers and purchases than it receives in terms of taxes, which has actually been true in the United States for recent decades, then in order to balance its books, the government needs to borrow money from the financial sector. That money can come from household savings, from in principle, firms could also save, and then also from the rest of the world. Now, it turns out that in practice, the US borrows a lot of money from the rest of the world, as you will see later on this quarter. But really, the government decides on three things: on transfers, on government purchases, and on how many taxes to give. And in fact, today there's a discussion in the US Senate about a long-run budget agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're thinking about, they've already lowered taxes, right? They've done that already in a tax cut. Now the Senate has agreed to increase spending on transfers. For example, the child health insurance program called CHIP has been expanded and extended as well. And then on top of that, they've decided to spend more on the military. Given current geopolitical realities, they feel it's necessary to spend more money on the military. So what they're doing is they're reducing the size of taxes, they're increasing the transfers, and they're increasing the government purchases. So to balance the books, they will have to borrow an increasing amount of money from the financial sector, either from foreigners or from US households, or potentially from firms if they set money aside and build reserves. Now, that means that because the difference between what the size of the incoming arrow of taxes for the government and the outcoming arrow of transfers and government purchases, that's called the deficit. The government's going to run a bigger deficit going forward. So one of the things to think about in this flow diagram is then why would the government issue transfers? What's the consequence of raising taxes? And what's the benefit of doing government purchases? And this the 5.1 is split up in basically three parts. One is about the the outgoing arrow, so government purchases and transfers. And then the next one is about taxation. And then the final one is about government borrowing. Now, to put this kind of in a perspective and all together, let's look at the incoming and the outgoing arrows, both at different sides of an income statement. So what the government does is it has arrows that have come into it, taxes that they get in revenue, and then the amount of money it borrows. Then it pays for the stuff it buys. So that could be for infrastructure, it could be for the costs of running the legal system, the judicial system. But also the cost of, say, public schools. And then on top of that, there are transfer payments. The biggest transfer payments in the United States are in the form of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. In most countries, have Social Security is a big form of transfer payments, and as well are medical care payments, like in countries that have a single payer system, like Canada or France or the UK. Those are big payments by the government. Now, on top of that, what was not in the circular flow diagram, once the government borrows, it also owes interest on the debt that it has outstanding. So there's something else called interest payments that the government also spends money on. The higher the debt is going to be, the bigger this part of interest payments is going to be as part of government outlays. So part 5.1 is really just about what the government spends money on in terms of government purchases, what the government spends money on in terms of transfer payments, the effect of taxes, and then interest payments and government borrowing. I want to talk a little bit through the effect of taxes. In order to do that, let me go through the part that shows the effect of taxation. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at something called the lever curve. An urban legend has it that Arthur Lever, who was an economist at the University of Chicago, drew on a napkin for Donald Rumsfeld, who was working for the campaign for Ronald Reagan, who wasn't president at the time, he was running against Jimmy Carter, ran the following thing. He said, what is the total amount of revenue as a function of the tax rate? He drew it like this. In the lecture, we'll draw it the other way around. But and he basically made the case that you can lower taxes and increase revenue. And that turns out to be something that most economists agree on, that under certain assumptions, tax rates can be lowered and revenue can be going up. And the fundamental insight in this is that tax revenue is the product of two things. It's the product of a tax base and a tax rate. Now, if I raise the taxes, so the area of this rectangle is total tax revenue. Now, the trick is that if I raise the tax rate, the tax base might go down. So even though I go up along the vertical axis, I might go inwards along the horizontal axis, and the resulting rectangle is actually going to be smaller if the tax base responds a lot to the tax rate. Now, that sounds a little cryptic, but think about it this way. Think about, say, taxes on sodas, which has been one of the things that people have been discussing recently. You know, if you increase the tax rate on sodas, because sugary sodas, because you think that it would be good to induce people to drink fewer sodas, then if you increase the tax rate a lot, then people will drink no sodas at all, or very few. You'd actually get very little revenue because you're selling very few bottles of soda over which you're actually getting tax revenue. And this is true for anything with a tax rate and a tax base. The most famous argument of this is on the labor supply. At the end, you know, most of us work because we're earning a wage, not because we enjoy it. And as a result, if we have to give an increasing part of the wage that we earn away to the government, then we would tend to end up working less, because the benefit of working in terms of what we can actually buy per hour that we work goes down because the tax rate is going up. And so this lecture is doing this exactly in the content text of Adam. So I wanted to show that to you. I know this is a pretty complicated interactive, but I thought it's fun. And then I remember that I was really surprised when I saw this for the first time. And so here it is. Here's our friend Adam again. And see, let's see what happens. So Adam here is working. The price of ice cream is 2. He has some preferences. Let's leave them as is. This story is not necessarily about preferences. Then he makes a wage. Let's give him a little higher wage so he's a little bit more happy. Yay, look at him. He's cheering up already. So, and then over the wage, he pays an income tax. Now this income tax here is 70%, was 70%. Let me reset this for you for a second. We'll raise his wage again. There you are. So he's paying a 70% income tax. That's a large income tax where you pay 70% of every dollar you earn back to the government. Now this would have been approximately the marginal tax rate for very rich people. So very rich people in the United States until the 1970s basically paid a 70% marginal tax rate on their income. So for every additional dollar they earned, they only brought home about 30 cents. These days, the actual marginal tax rate for Americans, rich Americans, is much lower. But if you live in a country in Europe, a 70% marginal tax rate is actually not unusual if you make a lot of money. So what happens to Adam? This is a very high tax rate. Now, if you lower this high tax rate, then we're even off the charts here. Let me lower his wage a little. Then what we can do is we could look at the income tax rate that Adam pays, the rate of, and the taxes that Adam pays in total. So this is the fraction of income that Adam pays in terms of his income that he pays back to the government. This is the total amount of taxes he pays. And look at what happens here. If you have a really big tax rate, he basically, at a tax rate of 90%, 93%, what's happening is Adam doesn't even want to work anymore. He's just going to live off whatever wealth he has. He says, you know what? It's not worth working for me anymore. So I'm not going to work. I'm just going to spend whatever money I already have on ice cream, and for the rest, I'm just going to call it a day, sit in the sun, and enjoy the weather. Because for every dollar that I make, I have to hand so much into the government that it's not worth working. So what happens is that at a really high tax rate, Adam actually doesn't pay taxes. You see that? Now you wouldn't be surprised that if there's no taxes charged, that Adam also doesn't pay any taxes. But somewhere in the middle, Adam pays positive taxes. And so if I go, like I'm doing now, go from 100% tax rate to a 0% tax rate on income, you see in both cases, the total taxes paid by Adam, and thus the total revenue earned by the government from Adam's tax payments, is 0. So there's actually a top here, somewhere at a tax rate of 40%. Now don't take this too seriously. We didn't choose all of these numbers to make this match reality. It's just to illustrate the point. At a tax rate above 40% here, a little higher than 40%, more like 45%. At a tax rate above that, and the tax revenue is declining in the tax rate because Adam's labor supply response is going to be so severe to an increase in the tax rate that it just lowers the tax base by so much that Adam pays less taxes. So this has to do, the fact that this goes down has to do with the fact that Adam's labor supply responds pretty quickly to the increase in the tax rate. Now, at lower tax rates, the opposite is true. Adam's labor supply does not change a lot. Actually, you see that this red dot is not moving, this red square is not moving a lot along the horizontal axis. And the increase in the tax rate doesn't make Adam change its work behavior, its labor supply behavior a lot. And as a result, he pays more taxes when the taxes go up. And that was Arthur Lever's main insight. The main insight was that not always when you raise taxes are you going to get more revenue. Because if people change their behavior a lot in response to the change in the tax rate, they might lower the tax base over which you raise the rate to such a degree that the total revenue actually goes down. Now that is an important insight because it says that in principle, a tax cut can generate higher tax revenue. But not only that, it's also stimulating people to work more, and therefore it's going to stimulate output in GDP and overall economic activity. This is known as a supply-side argument in economics, where taxes affect the supply of factors on production in the economy. You can think of the labor income tax as affecting the supply of labor, but you can also think of taxes on capital or corporate income taxes affecting the supply of capital goods and on kind of entrepreneurship in general in the economy. So the big discussion, I think this is a controversial argument, but the fundamental argument here is not controversial. I think most economists agree with what you're seeing here on the screen. Yeah, if you raise taxes to 100% on labor, most people won't work because the only people that will work are workaholics who just enjoy working and who want to be away from their home and for reasons that we won't discuss here, but they probably need some help. Now, most people will basically not work, and you would have no tax revenue from those people. Now, if you don't raise any taxes, you have no revenue either. So most economists don't disagree with the fact that there is this particularly mountain-sloped curve that has a peak. What we disagree on, many of us disagree on, is on which side of the peak are we? Are we on the side where you lower taxes, you stimulate economic activity, you stimulate the supply of labor, you stimulate the supply of capital, and that causes the economy to grow? Or are we on the side where that stimulative effect is not that big, and in fact, you raise tax revenue tax revenue goes up when you raise the income tax, but the overall effect on economic activity is not that big because the effect of taxes on people's behavior is not that big. Now remember that the fact that households' labor supply behavior is affected by taxes is something that we call a distortion, and we studied that already extensively both in Part 4.2 as well as in Part 3. Now here you're really seeing this distortion at work and the effect this distortion has on potentially has on government tax revenue. Now in the US, we recently had a very big tax cut, especially on corporate income taxes, so what corporations actually pay in taxes on their profits. And the discussion very much on the effect of this tax rate and how it's affecting tax revenue is really on how big the effect is on the supply of capital and the economy, the supply side effects. Now, this is really the most complicated interactive in week 5, but I hope that it really teaches you how to think about the lever curve and the arguments that people have about the effects of taxes on how much people want to work and how much firms want to invest, and think through that in kind of in a real life application. Then in part 5.2, we're discussing how much what the effects are of the government on the overall economy. The first part is on the long run effects, and it kind of goes back to, largely discusses things that are related to the 3 main sectors we discussed in part 4.1, so healthcare, knowledge and ideas, and public goods. So I want to skip that because you can kind of read that part back on the long run effects of economic policy, kind of revisit the part 4.1 if you think there's some things you've missed there. Remember, 4.1 is going to be also part of your final material for the final, so you have to make sure you understand that correctly. So what I'd like to do is end this last 10 minutes with something that's probably one of the most controversial topics in economics, which is to what extent can the government intervene to stabilize the economy. So I want to tell you a little story and kind of talk through kind of what the costs were of the Great Depression and why economists started thinking about this differently than thinking through just the efficient market idea that the market would cause an efficient allocation of resources. And there was one economist in particular who made this point that the market might not result in an efficient allocation, and these inefficiencies might be actually much bigger during economic downturns, and that was John Maynard Keynes. So we'll discuss some of Keynes' view, do it in a couple of minutes. He wrote a very big book. You can read a lot about him. Of course, this is not the only thing you're supposed to do for this course. You're also supposed to go through the course material. And after that, we will talk a little bit through what the government can do in terms of stabilization. What you see is that a lot of times this talk about fiscal policy and stabilization in recessions is called Keynesian economics. But really, people were not Keynesian, propose very similar things. So the fact of the matter is that you want to think through this again through the circular flow diagram and just see that the three things we just identified as red arrows in the circular flow diagram that I showed you are the three channels through which the government can basically use its instruments to help stabilize economic activity in case of a downturn, or if it wants, reduce economic activity if the government feels like the economy is overheating, although that is a much less common discussion point. So let me pull that up for you and we'll give it a try. So I recorded the course material contains a whole video on the Great Depression, on the discussion of Keynes and the Great Depression. I think some of you might be old enough to remember the Great Recession that happened in 2008. The Great Depression happened in 1929. But what you really have to think about is this. In times of, in recessions, this is one of the famous pictures from the Great Recession where people are in line waiting at a soup kitchen. You see free soup. And this is in New York City in the Great Depression, so around 1930. Remember that in economic downturns, and we already saw this when we studied the unemployment rate goes up. A lot of people want to work. There's a lot of labor supply, but there's simply no demand for them. And then the question is, why doesn't the market mechanism make sure that this demand and supply are being equated? Why are there such deviations? Now, the Great Depression that happened in 1929 saw a lot of farms go out of business. There was a lot of unused farmlands. A lot of factories had to close, even though their machines went idle and they could have been used. We're seeing all these unused resources. Now, it's hard to imagine that a whole pile of unused resources in the economy, no matter whether it's capital goods like machines and buildings and farmland, or whether it's workers like these people in line or waiting for at the soup kitchen, these people could have been working, making money, and spending it. It's hard to think about how this can be an efficient allocation of resources. So the magnitude of the Great Depression made economists rethink this idea that economic fluctuations are just some efficient fluctuations in the overall economy that come with the standard market mechanism. So that's the most important thing to take away from kind of what happened in the Great Depression. So there was an economist called John Maynard Keynes who really, let me just pull him up for you. There he is. John Maynard Keynes, who really made the point that, if you think that this recession that they called the Great Depression, but even now, more recently, the Great Recession from 2008, was not the result of efficient market fluctuations, then the question is, what did cause it? what inefficiencies, what deviations from efficiency caused it, and how can government policies affect these inefficiencies and reduce or even prevent recessions from happening or reduce the magnitude of recessions. Now, that idea that at the core of recessions, there are some things that are causing them as inefficient fluctuations, and the degree to which these fluctuations are inefficient is an important part of Keynesian economic thinking. But even people who are not Keynesian necessarily, who don't think these inefficiencies are extremely large, Keynesians tend to think that these inefficiencies are really large, and they generally also think that they are driven by self-fulfilling prophecies, self-fulfilling expectations on the demand side of the economy, so that recessions are really a shortfall in the demand in the economy. It has nothing to do with the supply side of the economy. But even if you don't really buy that these inefficiencies are so big, it's still, even if a party that's not necessarily driven by Keynesian motives and is in power during a downturn, will feel political pressure to reduce the cost of this downturn. And so what are the policy measures that the government can put in place to actually think about stabilization policies? Well, those come down to the following three channels. The government can, if there's a real shortfall in demand, and there's people unemployed, and there's factories not being used, then the government can start buying stuff that's produced with the unused resources. There's two advantages of this. One is, at times when there's a lot of workers unemployed, and there's a lot of unused resources like idle factories, unused farmlands, think about things like that. If the government decides to produce something then, or buy something then and have it produced for it, the price of what it buys will be relatively low, because it will be buying these goods and services to be produced with factors for which the demand is really low. So there's an advantage simply for that reason to increase government purchases from the government's end when these purchases are cheap, and that turns out to be in economic downturns. Now, on top of that, that's a pure accounting argument. On top of that, what you do obviously is that once you start buying goods and services as the government in a recession, and then that's going to get more people employed. Those people make money, and the money they make, they are going to spend again on stuff that firms produce. And that circular effect that's inherent in the circular flow diagram will mean that that $1 that the government spends could go around more than once. Now, how often a dollar of government spending goes around in the circular flow diagram and generates spending on top of spending on top of spending, from spending to income to spending to income, that's called the multiplier, the government spending multiplier. And how big that government spending multiplier is depends there's very controversial. It's at least one, because, well, it doesn't even have to be one, actually. So let me take that back. But most people think at least it's one, because when the government buys something, that's one. It increases demand by one. Now, it could also, in principle, actually, that if the government starts buying stuff in a recession, but that makes stuff from other firms more expensive, that other firms buy more expensive, it might reduce the demand by the other firms and actually crowd demand out. The same is true for investment. So that's on the spending side. And this is sometimes called deficit spending, because what the government doesn't want to do is raise taxes, because if it raises taxes to cover its government spending at the same time, then it would actually, in principle, increase demand through the government purchases and then reduce the demand again through the back pocket by raising taxes. So this is implicitly called deficit spending, because the implicit assumption is you raise government purchases, you don't adjust taxes, and you finance it through deficit. Once the economy recovers, people make a lot of money, then you raise taxes and pay back the debt that you incurred during the recession. Okay, that's one channel. The next channel is through taxes. One other way to stimulate spending is by lowering the tax rate. If you lower the tax rate, then what we know as Then what we know as people's disposable income actually goes up. People get more money in their pocket that they can spend, and that stimulates spending again. And the spending itself then generates income for other people who then spend again, and you're going to be in the same kind of multiplier loop. Tax cuts during recessions have happened. The lecture material contains some examples of that. Opponents of that think that it's better for people themselves to decide what they spend money on than for the government to decide where it spends money on in terms of government purchases. You have to think whether that's true or not. So those are proponents of tax cuts during the recession. Opponents say that tax cuts tend to disproportionately benefit people with high income level, but those people have a higher savings rate. They actually spend a smaller portion of their income. This is called the marginal propensity to consume. It's the fraction of your income you spend on consumption of additional income. So these people, you give these people additional income, they're not spending much of it. They're putting most of it back in the bank account. Now, in that case, the argument is that you could, in principle, a tax cut is not giving the money back to the people who actually stimulate spending the most. And so in that sense, tax cuts during recessions are probably not the biggest effect on spending. There are other things that have bigger effects, like directly spending it as a government. Now, these are both two sides of the same coin, and which argument you believe or not, this really depends on what you think is more important. Whether you think it's more important that households are more efficient in deciding what they spend their own money on than the government is, or whether you think the redistributive effects of tax cuts largely offset the stimulative spending effects. So that's on taxes. So then the next and the final channel through which the government can do stabilization policies is through transfers. And this is actually a very common way of doing stabilizing the economy, common instrument. And in most countries, this instrument is actually legislated in. It's part of the plumbing of the economic system. So think about unemployment insurance benefits. So people who become unemployed in most countries for a while, they get benefits to cover their loss of income due to job loss. And so in recessions, more people become unemployed, they get laid off. And so the amount of money that's being transferred from the government to the households that are subject to job loss increases, and automatically goes up during recessions. So the fact that some of these transfers are inherently plumbed into the way we've organized our social security and welfare systems means that those things are often called automatic stabilizers. So that's the third thing. Well, that pretty much concludes this office hour. This part of the course covers these three. For part 5.2 covers these. Actually, the part on stabilization policy covers these three channels and discusses their pros and cons in great detail. I'm not here to tell you what you think the government should use as a stabilization policy and to what extent it should use it. But I hope that this part provides you with a framework to think through the costs and benefits of each of those options, and helps you think through and form your own opinion about what you think is useful for the government to do in economic downturns. And for that, of course, again, think about using marginal analysis. What's the marginal cost and what's the marginal benefit? Is the marginal cost higher at this moment or the marginal benefit? How do you relate these two things? And when you do that, you can get a real good sense of what the arguments are for and against each of these three stabilization policy measures, and why the government could potentially use all of them or either of them. Okay, I hope this helps, and I hope this helps you go through the part 5 of the course. If you're through that, there's 2 more weeks to go. But in the week 7, we only have 1 part of new material on trade. The last part of week 7 will be a review and some talk about exam strategy. I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope to see you next week. Okay, bye.